You.
Yes, me. Me too.
Okay, so for this video, I'm going to be catching up with the Matrix movies because the fourth one is coming out next week here in Canada, and I am really excited. To be honest, I've only watched the first movie, but I really like it. And the first time that I watched it, I was like 16 years old. I enjoyed it quite a bit, but it didn't really click with me. It was just like a good movie that I just never watched again up until this year, when they came out with the trailer for the fourth Matrix movie, and then I felt like I wanted to watch the first one to refresh my memory and think whether or not I wanted to watch the sequels in order to watch the fourth one coming out this year. So when I watched it, it finally clicked, and now I really enjoy it. I'm not gonna lie to you and say that I've liked the Matrix for years now, that I grew up watching them, because now I grew up and they were there, but I definitely did not watch them until like a couple of years ago. I watched the first one, and in this video I'm gonna be catching up with the sequels. And I know that people say that they're not good, that they're just like too many fight scenes and too much philosophy. But anyways, I'm gonna watch them for my own, and then after I'm done with them, I'm gonna come back and talk to you about what I think of these movies. So let's get started. Okay, so now I finally watched the sequels, and I gotta be honest, I really like them. But before I begin my actual review, I want to talk to you about one of the biggest reasons why I never watched the sequels, other than the fact that I didn't love the first movie when I watched it the first time. So my friend Jake, I met him like 4 years ago when I moved to Canada to study film, and ever since I met him, he's been trying to get me to watch the sequels, and I just never wanted to, because to be honest, I just heard too many negative comments about these movies. And even though you shouldn't trust Rotten Tomatoes when the last movie of the trilogy has like 30%, it's kind of understandable not to want to watch the sequels. But anyways, as you know, I watched them, I really like them, and here's why. My first point is that I think that the sequels are definitely not on the same level as the first movie, but at the same time, I don't think they're that far away from each other, because there's so many fans of the first movie, and they all talk about how revolutionary it was, how ahead of its time it was, how fresh it felt back then, and they're right. But the first movie definitely has a lot of the problems that the sequels have, just to a smaller, lesser degree, I guess. For example, the cheesy dialogue, and also the fact that for some reason when the characters are on the ships or in Zion, they act like sort of normal people, but when they get plugged into the Matrix, they automatically change, and like they just act like they're so much cooler. And I understand that if you're in the Matrix and you can do what these characters can do, well, you're definitely gonna feel more confident, maybe even cooler, I guess. But it's just so strange, because like, yes, they got awkward dialogue inside of Matrix and outside of a Matrix, but when they're inside of a Matrix, they just act so cool.
Okay, you have some skill.
And I don't understand why, and it's one of my bigger problems with the movies. But that's a part of an even bigger problem, and it is the script. In my opinion, the first Matrix and the sequels have a great story, and I really like the backstory of the movies. I'm planning on talking a little bit more in depth about the lore of the Matrix in another video, when I also talk about the Animatrix. However, like I said, I think that the strongest point of these movies is the story, the plot. However, the script is kind of bad. The characters can be pretty bland. The story can be a little confusing, especially on the third movie, but to be fair, I don't think it's nearly as boring or confusing as everyone says. I just feel like The Matrix is such a good story, but the execution was not the best, and it's also a product of its time. It definitely follows a lot of trends from the early 2000s. You know, everything has an early 2000 vibe. But anyways, now that you know a little bit better how I feel about the sequels, I'm going to be talking about each movie individually. People generally like The Matrix Reloaded a lot more than the third movie. I think that my biggest problem with the second Matrix movie is the fact that at the beginning, like the first the first hour feels pretty repetitive. It's like big action scene and then philosophic talk, and then that's pretty much the structure of the first hour. And also the characters are pretty passive, especially Neo, who pretty much throughout almost the whole movie is just doing what other people tell him to do. This, as well as the fact that he's sort of Superman in the Matrix, it just makes you feel like there's no stakes. And I guess this is as good a moment as any other to talk about one of my bigger issues with the sequels, and to be honest, the whole trilogy. And it is that unfortunately the style of the movies sometimes overshadows the substance. That same substance gets buried under tons of fight scenes, tons of monologues, and tons of latex and sunglasses. So while these movies can feel a lot of times like style over substance, I also gotta give them credit, because nowadays everything's a reboot, everything's a sequel, everything's based on an intellectual property. Especially in like Marvel nowadays, a lot of movies just feel the same. They don't have their own style and they don't feel unique, and the Matrix movies definitely feel unique, which takes me to one of my positives of this movie, and it is that the production design is just top notch. Even though there's a lot of dated CGI, I feel like they're still holding up for the most part. And one of the biggest reasons for me to feel that way is the fact that, especially on Zion, you can just feel that you're there. There's a lot of practical sets, and I really appreciate that, especially like I said, with so many movies that are just so reliant on CGI and green screens. The Matrix and its sequels feel so just tactile, and I just love that. And I don't want this video to be too long, so I'm gonna wrap this up by saying that the story is really good and that it might be my favorite Matrix movie, especially because of the ending. Because if you've watched this, you've definitely watched the whole trilogy. So it's not a spoiler to tell you that the ending kind of flipped everything around. When Neo meets the architect and he realizes that the one is not that unique, and that there have been other ones in the past, and every time that they get to the source, they just reboot the Matrix, and that the red pills and the whole resistance is just another layer of control that the machines put into effect. That's just great. And yeah, it sort of makes the ending of the first movie feel not important anymore, but I just really like it, and I like the way it was revealed. I like how the movie ends on a cliffhanger, and that it feels like both movies are just one very long movie. One last thing before I talk about the third movie is that I just don't get why people just hate the scene with the architect, but overall I think it's a really good scene, and I love this ending. Now I'm going to talk to you about the third Matrix. The third Matrix movie, in my opinion, definitely is the worst movie of the trilogy. And even though I think that it has more flaws than the second and the first movie, I still really like it, except for the ending. But I'm gonna talk about that later in the video. One of the things that I like the most about this movie is that it just feels like part 2 of the sequels. This movie has all of the strong points from the previous movies, but it has more bad aspects, especially related to the script. So I'm going to talk about that first. One of the things that I really don't like about this movie is just Zion. It's never been great. The first movie had that weird rave scene and all that, and pretty much every character in Zion is just as bland as every other character in the movies. But in this movie, I feel like this problem is even bigger, because halfway through there's this big battle of Zion, and I really think that this was not handled the best way that it could have been. I was kind of confused of the geography of Zion. I know that it was underground, but I just didn't understand so well like what was going on, especially in the first 15 minutes of the battle. I eventually assumed that it was like layers, and the machines were just going through each layer of defense until they got to and that was the last layer. And even though I definitely wanted humans to win, I'm a human myself, I just didn't feel sad when any of the characters died or sacrificed themselves. And even though I did feel pretty sad when Trinity dies, and even though I wanted Neo to be happy and eventually live with Trinity and be happy forever, I just can't deny that I don't believe that these guys love each other. Yeah, they kiss, yeah, they worry about each other, yeah, they protect each other, but they're so, I don't know, they just don't have much chemistry. Another problem that I had with this movie is that Morpheus kind of is not as important in this movie as in the first one, and in the second one he's definitely still important, but I feel like with each movie he's like more on the sidelines of the story. And that's definitely gonna hurt your movie, especially because Lawrence Fishburne is such a good actor. Finally, my biggest problem with the movie is the ending. Not the very ending, but like the climax of the movie. People complain so much about the Matrix movies not making sense, and I feel like this part of the whole trilogy is where I actually understand them the most. The first time that I watched the ending, I had to go back a couple of scenes in the movie because I just didn't understand the whole plan that Neo had and the deal that he made with the machines. Like, I understood that he was gonna help them somehow, but I feel like the plan didn't make much sense. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I just feel like it doesn't make sense. Because apparently the whole plan was that Agent Smith was just such a bad virus and he took over the whole population of the Matrix. But for some reason the machines that created the Matrix could not stop him. And I just don't understand why. Especially when the plan is that Neo is going to fight him and somehow defeat him by letting him assimilate him and make a copy on Neo himself. Because if the whole plan is that Neo is going to be plugged into the Matrix, and then when Smith makes a copy of himself in Neo, the machines are gonna get the chance to somehow kill him, that just doesn't make sense in my opinion. I could be wrong. They could be retconning this in some of the other Matrix content that came out after. But in this movie, I feel like the ending is definitely the weakest point of the whole trilogy. Because every single human is still plugged into the machines, and I don't understand how the machines don't just use one of the other regular guys that are already infected with Smith and are still plugged into the Matrix and just use them the same way that they use Neo. And the only explanation that I can find is that Neo is the one and that he has powers both inside and outside of the Matrix for some reason that was also not explained. So I guess what I want to say with this is that it can make sense, but it's just not explained properly or at all, to be honest. Yeah, you can read some of the comics or play the Matrix online or, read any other Matrix related content which is going to sort of explain the ending, but I didn't, and I'm not reviewing the other content, I'm reviewing the movies. So that is why I don't like the ending of the Matrix. Well, it's not like I don't like it, I just don't like the execution. And if you paid attention to my whole review, that's pretty much how I feel about the Matrix as a whole. I love the story, I love the world building, and I definitely am looking forward to learning more about the Matrix, watching the new movie. But overall, I feel like the whole trilogy was just not handled in the best way. This movie could have been great, and I respect the Wachowskis for creating this. But if I'm completely honest, and I'm not trying to be disrespectful at all, I just feel like they were not the best screenwriters for the project. They're very competent directors. They created an amazing world and crafted a really good story. But overall, they were just not great screenwriters. And I really hope that the fourth Matrix movie is at least as good as the sequels. So anyways, that's sort of my review / thoughts on the whole trilogy. As always, thanks for watching, subscribe, like, do all that fun stuff, and I will see you next time.